dermis is the layer that's deep to the epidermis, and it's the functional, flexible, richly innervated and vascularized layer that really helps to support the epidermis. It's important to understand, and we'll talk about this when you look at burns, but if you rip the epidermis away from the dermis, one, the epidermis will die. Two, you cannot regenerate the epidermis without the presence of the dermis. Right? It doesn't make sense. You need the blood supply, you need the nutrients and the nerves and all of that good stuff, the supportive structures which are in the dermis. There are two layers to the dermis. There's a papillary dermis, which is a smaller layer. And the most important thing here is the formation of fingerprints. And then there's a deeper, thicker reticular dermis. The word reticular means deep. And this is 80% of the thickness of the dermis. And this has everything else. This has the sweat glands, the blood vessels, the nerve endings, the erector pili muscle, which is responsible for giving you goosebumps, making your hairs stand on end. All of that is found in the deeper reticular layer of the dermis. Okay. So let's talk about the dermal papillae and the papillary dermis. Now, there's an infolding. So if you look at this image, the epidermis is above, and then the papillary layer of the dermis is actually thrown into these folds that help to increase the surface area. So as I mentioned before, nutrients and gas and oxygen and waste has to diffuse from the dermis up into the epidermis. And so the folding of the papillary layer of the dermis helps to increase the surface area across which these nutrients and waste can be exchanged or can diffuse, right? Now, associated with these foldings, there's what we call the epidermal ridge. And that's the area of the epidermis that is folded as a result of the papillary layer being folded. So I'll say that again. The papillary layer of the dermis is folded, and because it folds itself, it has to project upwards into the epidermis, which is on top. And so this forms some epidermal ridges. These epidermal ridges are what we call the friction ridges or the fingerprints. So when you look at your fingers, the grooves or bumps that you see in the epidermis is actually a result of the bumps or the foldings of the papillary layer of the dermis. And this gives your fingers some extra gripping ability so that you can hold on to certain things more easily because of the presence of those ridges. They're sometimes called friction ridges because they help with increase the friction as you grab something, and they form your fingerprints, right? All right, so moving along. The reticular layer of the dermis, which we said accounts for most of the thickness of the dermis, has a few important features. First of all, it's made of dense irregular connective tissue, which is a thick form of connective tissue. And this tissue organizes itself where there are certain separations between collagen fibers. So there's lots of collagen in the dermis, and there's some areas where those collagen fibers have a natural separation. This is called the cleavage line. Now, cleavage lines in the image here in the middle are all over the body, and they're in a typical arrangement, usually running up and down the limbs, right? Up and down the upper and lower limbs, around the elbows and the knees. They typically go around, and then around the trunk, around the neck, around the face. And these lines will be useful for surgeons to cut along these lines, right? You don't want to cut against any of these lines because that's going to impede the time it takes for that wound to heal. It's better to cut along these lines. So surgery along the abdomen is typically going according to those lines, those cleavage lines. Surgery along the thorax or the chest, again, will typically run in accordance with those cleavage lines just to help with the healing process afterwards. The second structure that we see formed in the reticular dermis are the flexure lines, and these are deep creases that are found again in those collagen fibers. So there are certain deep creases from areas where you continually fold, like you continually fold your elbow, you continually fold your fingers, your knees, even in your face, those smile lines are flexure lines. Okay, and this is sometimes found in the fingers and toes as well. Now, we want to point out here that the reticular layer of the dermis has a rich nerve supply, as well as it is well vascularized. So there are two vascular plexuses here, the dermal plexus and the subpapillary plexus. The dermal plexus specifically feeds the dermis, whereas the subpapillary plexus will feed the epidermis. So the subpapillary plexus is going to communicate with the epidermis above, and that's how those nutrients can diffuse to feed the epithelial layer, whereas the dermal plexus is going to feed the dermis itself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these vessels, right, these subpapillary plexuses play an important role in regulating the body temperature. Right, we're going to shunt blood in either direction depending on if the body's cold or if the body temperature is hot. So these are the example of the friction ridges which we mentioned, and these are formed in the papillary layer of the dermis. So these are the friction ridges or the epidermal ridges. And then these are the flexure lines. So the flexure lines which we mentioned were formed in areas of the body that undergo continuous folding. Okay. Any question on those structures in the dermis? Any questions about the dermis? Okay, so we're going to keep moving along. We're going to speak about the hypodermis next. So as I mentioned before, the hypodermis, also called superficial fascia, sometimes the superficial layer, sometimes loose connective tissue. The dermis is pretty much made of fat. So you can associate the dermis with just underlying fat underneath the dermis. It also has some loose connective tissue, which helps to anchor it to the underlying structures, such as the muscles and the bones. It helps to insulate the body. So we know fat is a big energy storer. It's a big area that the body stores energy. And so it does that very well. And then it has different distributions in males and females. So males typically have that fat distributed in the abdominal region, whereas females typically have that hypodermis fat distributed in the thighs and in the breast and in the buttocks region. Okay. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about pigment. So factors that influence the color of skin. The first pigment is melanin. Melanin is probably the most important pigment. It's made from a molecule called tyrosine. Now there are different variations in skin color which are attributed to the presence or absence of melanin, and it's made by melanocytes. Melanocytes, can anyone remember what layer melanocytes were found in? Which we talked about. So just to refresh ourselves, which layer had melanocytes of the epidermis? The stratum basale, right? So the stratum basale had two important cells, the tactile epithelial cells and your melanocytes, right? Now, I also mentioned earlier that melanocytes produce melanin in response to the sun. So melanocytes are pretty much secreting this pigment that actually shields the nucleus of keratinocytes. So keratinocytes are the major cells that form the skin. And when they produce, or when they are exposed to sun, they signal to melanocytes to produce more melanin, and that pigment actually sits over the nucleus of the keratinocyte, and it basically is protecting the keratinocyte from the sun. So the melanocyte is basically helping to protect the keratinocyte by producing melanin. Okay. Carotene is another type of pigment. It's a yellowish pigment typically found in foods like carrots, tomatoes, pumpkin. And if you eat a lot of that food, you can certainly have this pigment deposited into the mucous membranes. You can see it in the nails sometimes. You can see it in the iris of the eyes, that yellowish pigment from these foods. Finally, hemoglobin is a pigment that can also contribute to the color of skin. It's typically seen in lighter complexion, so mostly Caucasian skin will have the color of blood showing through underneath the skin. And so hemoglobin can attribute to the pinkish or bluish hue of skin sometimes. So these are the three pigments that usually contribute to the color of skin.